Hey, welcome to the channel. We hope that you enjoy today's stories and check out the chapters on the video to see all the stories for today. But before we get into this video, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to get notified when we release a new video. So let's get into the video.
What is a secret that your family or friends didn't want you to know?
Story 1. For me, it's a friend's dad. He left the family when my friend was young but would occasionally send a gift or card. My friend got a Facebook message one day from a woman who had been doing ancestry research. It turns out the dad had done the same thing, get married, have kids, bail, several times, and my friend has a crapload of half-siblings he never knew about. They're all friends now. Story 2. Long after my dad died, my mom finally admitted to us that he was always just the second option, and the man she visited often with us and without our dad during holidays was actually the love of her life. But he had a wife and kids, and my mom had our dad as her husband and us. So, they never got themselves. This man later moved to the US and died there in a car accident. Story 3. My grandmother was the child of forced intercourse. Her older brother forced his younger sister and she was the result. Despite it all, she was smarter than a freaking whip. Nobody could beat her in chess or Scrabble. Biggest heart. To hear that and then hear how her family hated her for being born. One story that stuck with me is when she was young, she got in an accident sledding. She got a large gash on her head and her grandparents, wanted her to die, so they let her bleed and bleed. She survived and fixed herself up at the age of 8. Her grandfather, then continued to force intercourse her until she moved out. My grandma had the worst and hardest life growing up, but she never let that make her ugly. She had 200+ people go to her funeral and all of them called her auntie because she took care of all the kids that got dumped by their alcoholic parents. She once said she was taking care of 20 kids at some point at the age of 15. Only respect and love for my grandma. Hard life, but man, one of a kind woman. Edit, my grandma was always humble in her kindness. Never once told anyone if she gave someone money, helped them recover from drugs by giving them a home, taking in all stray animals, and loving and only encouraging others. She never had a bad thing to say about anyone. Even the worst of people, she'd say they are hurting. Someone needs to remind them someone loves them. She'd be very bashful and red-faced hearing these kind comments. She had a hard time taking compliments and praise, but it always meant the world to her. I'm sure she's thanking all of you for being very sweet. Story 4. I know someone that did 23andMe and learned that her dad wasn't her father, and she had almost 200 half-siblings. Turns out that the fertility doctor her parents saw was just using his own sperm to help couples conceive. Last I heard she was up to almost 300 known half-siblings. And here's the crazy bit. That guy was not the only doctor doing that. Several fertility doctors were doing it all over the world back in the 70s and 80s, and no one caught on until home DNA tests became a thing. Some of the known half-sibling superclusters have almost 1,000 people in them. Story 5. My family never talked about my grandfather. I knew he died before I was born, but that was it. When I was about 15, my mother told me he was a terrible man who used to beat my father and their entire family. Eventually, he tried to axe murder my dad at his work, and somehow my dad fought him off. Next attempt, my grandfather waited with a shotgun to end my dad when she showed up for work, but my dad was off for some reason. Grandpa eventually got tired of waiting and just ended himself. Apparently, my dad just never wanted us to know just how bad life can be and did everything to keep that buried. Story 6. I learned a bunch of stuff about my grandfather after he died. He was a bootlegger, running whiskey from Canada down the coast into New England. He was an arsonist, burning down several buildings owned by people he had grudges against. He eloped at 16, had several kids, and then completely bailed on that family a couple of years later. Story 7. My parents had a son before me. Neither one ever talked about him. In fact, nobody in my entire extended family, uncles, aunts, grandparents, ever mentioned him. I was adored and doted on. It was a happy, loving childhood. When I was 21, I found a box with old photos and saw my parents with a kid, asking my mom who it was. She simply looked at it and said that was her son. It came as quite a shock. When I tried to press for more info, she simply told me he died when he was 3. I wanted to know how, what, and when, but she stopped me in my tracks and he's never been brought up again. Edit to address some of the comments. I know that his passing was a result of an accident that took place whilst he was playing. I don't think it's my place to know all the details. He was born a decade before me, so even though I sometimes feel sad when I remember that he existed, I've never felt the need to grieve his loss because I never really knew him. If anything, my parents overcompensated with gifts, affection, and their time when I was growing up, so nothing ever felt off to me. I believe in letting bygones be bygones, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. Story 8. My maternal grandmother was married to a widower who had 4 children from his previous marriage. She made him give up his kids before she married him. I guess she didn't want to take care of his children. She became pregnant with my mother, and when my mother was about 5 years old, her parents, my grandparents, got divorced. He just couldn't live with my cold-hearted grandmother any longer. My mother didn't tell me that. I found out by coincidence that I had 4 uncles. Story 9. That the man stalking me / my mom for the first 12 years of my life was my biological father, and that he was an incredibly violent paranoid schizophrenic who had almost killed my mom. They only told me because I went for a walk with my friend around the neighborhood without telling my parents for the first time, and they lost their minds thinking my bio dad had gotten a hold of me. Story 10. When I was 17, I found out that my dad wasn't actually my biological dad. My mother had an affair and got pregnant. My parents knew I wasn't my father's child and decided to keep it a secret from my and my mother's side of the family. I grew up with 2 older and 1 younger sibling who turned out to be my half-siblings. I was treated differently my entire life, and when I found out I was an affair baby, I felt instant relief. I knew my whole life something was wrong within my family dynamic. I moved out when I was a teen. At 16, the last argument I had with my parents ended with me saying, "There's no way I'm related to you people. Something must have happened at birth." Story 11. My mother treated my wife like crap during our wedding because we didn't let her host the rehearsal dinner at my wife's uncle's house, didn't let her plan any of it, and did all of the work ourselves. I only learned that she'd been dragging my wife around by the arm to try to get her to cede control of aspects of the wedding a week after the wedding. She wonders why we don't see her more than twice a year. Story 12. When I was growing up, my family would always avoid talking about my paternal grandmother. I knew she had vanished when my father was just a teenager, but that was all. No one ever spoke about her, and any questions I asked were met with uncomfortable silence or swift topic changes. It was as if she had been erased from our family history. A few years ago, I stumbled upon an old box hidden in my dad's closet. Inside, I found a stack of letters and newspaper clippings. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started reading. Turns out, my grandmother was a victim of a high-profile kidnapping when my father was 16. The kidnappers had demanded a hefty ransom, but despite my grandfather's best efforts, he couldn't raise the amount in time. The police were involved, but they never managed to find her or the kidnappers. The case eventually went cold, and my father's family was left devastated. The letters in the box were a mix of desperate pleas for help, ransom negotiations, and letters my father had written to his missing mother, pouring out his heartache and longing for her return. To this day, I have never brought it up with my dad, but now I understand why her name was never mentioned. He spent his entire life trying to forget the tragedy and keep his own children safe from the painful truth. And even though I know the secret now, I will continue to protect his wishes and keep it to myself.
If you're enjoying today's video about stories of our lives, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this and more. Now, let's get back to the video.
Story 13. I've told this multiple times on Reddit, so I'll keep it short. A few years after we graduated high school, my best friend's mom was abducted early one morning from behind our high school. She was training to go on a hike with her brother in BC. Regardless, we searched like crazy. The community searched for her. It was a big deal and in the news like constantly. Eventually, it got to a point where it was only ever brought up in the news on the day she went missing, and every year all the armchair detectives would come out, very annoying TBH. Sometimes some information would come out from the police, but nothing helpful. It was about 7 to 8 years after she went missing her skull was found in a wooded area about 45 minutes from our city. The whole thing screwed me up like crazy. I had location trackers on a lot of my family's phones for a very long time. My friend, though, doesn't talk about it. Doesn't want to talk about it either. He has moved away now. I'm sure it's easier being away from somewhere where everyone knows your last name and will ask about it when they hear it. I remember when this all went down, everyone from our high school started messaging and talking to him, and it pissed him off. None of these people cared to talk to him any other time. Just knowing that I get anxious whenever someone I'm not particularly close with has something tragic happen to them. Do I say something? I know he didn't want anyone to talk to him about it. Hell, whenever something tragic happens to me, no, I don't need someone I haven't spoken to in a year coming out of the woodwork to tell me they're sorry for my loss or something. When this all went down, we told him from day one that our friend group would never ask him about it. If he wanted to talk about it, he could, and we would listen. If he didn't, we didn't need to. We almost never talked about it, and if we did, it was never about feelings. Just about new information on the case. He's not a heartless guy, and I know this shattered him. Story 14. I didn't know much about it, my grandfather, other than the fact he was a politician in El Salvador and was very much involved with the school my mom went to in her village. He died when my mom was around 15, just a few weeks before her quinceañera, from a gunshot wound. He was murdered one day after coming home from work. My mom was on the phone with someone, so I just waved hi because I didn't want to be rude and interrupt her phone call, but then she tells me to come to say hi to my aunt. My mom only had 2 sisters, so I thought it was one of the 2 sisters. But it wasn't either of my 2 aunts. Turns out my mom had a half-sister. I said hi and found out my other aunt lives in California with 2 of my other cousins, one who is my age and the other in her mid-20s. After the call, I asked my mom how to come. She never told me I had another aunt. Turns out my grandpa had an affair with another woman. The woman's husband died of a sickness, and when my grandfather comforted her, they both fell in love. He told her how he was going to leave my grandma and my mom and her sisters. He never left them. He was murdered by the father of his mistress because he didn't keep his promise. Since then, I never looked at my grandfather the same way, and no one visits his grave. Story 15. Oh, I've got one. I found out in my mid-30s that prior to marrying my father, my mom was an intercourse worker, confidence trickster, and arsonist. Seriously. She was an intercourse worker who was recruited in 1952 by a con man to bilk people out of their investment capital in a week and turn black and white photographic negatives into color photographs. We just need capital to develop the machinery scheme. Investors were shown negatives, black and white photographs, and color photos from the same negatives. It didn't occur to them that these were merely colorized black and white photos. When the investors gathered to see the wonder they had created, the entire building, the machinery, and all the plans went up in flames. The con man was promptly arrested. So was my mom. She agreed to testify against him in exchange for misdemeanor charges. Story 16. When I was 2, we moved into a really nice house in a rich neighborhood. Even though we wouldn't normally be able to afford it, we ended up moving to a much smaller house after 6 years. Later on, when I was a teenager, my dad was talking to someone about that house, and apparently the reason why we got that big, nice house for cheaper was that the previous owner committed self-deletion in the garage. The freaky part is that when we lived in that house, I had reoccurring nightmares about dying in the garage. Story 17. I found my mom's diary when I was 16. I didn't mean to snoop. I was looking through a bin of old family photos and found it. By the time I realized what it was, I couldn't stop reading. It was the diary she kept when I was 3 when she was in the psych ward after trying to kill herself. That was the first time I went into foster care. The diary was dark and trauma-laced, and she was clearly experiencing psychosis. I still have the diary tucked away almost 15 years later. I never told her that I found it. Story 18. My mother passed in August. We were estranged for about 10 years. In the box of her personal effects, I found a notebook which contained, I'd guess, a draft of a letter she wrote to my father while pregnant with me. It started out sort of calm, questioning why he won't reach out and the pain of his absence, but by the end, she was always long-winded. It devolved into a sort of screed, her hate seeping through the flowery sentences. I was inside her when she wrote that. Christ. My father did come back but left again around 2 years old. Haven't seen him since. I also found a Christmas card she sent to her mother when she was 19. She states she's not coming home for the holiday and that she needs some isolation to process her sins and guilt. She talks about how hopeless and confused she is, that she lacks direction or clarity. I knew she struggled all her life with depression, but it really stunned me she was so desolate at 19. As much as finding that saddened me, it added some perspective to a woman I never really understood, and I have an appreciation that I came out of that single-parent household a somewhat functional member of society. Story 19. Going through the old family computer one day and found out the real reason why my dad moved us to the other side of the country. Turns out it wasn't to be closer to our extended family like he told us. Apparently, Dad had turned in one of his fellow doctors at his clinic for giving out prescriptions for painkillers that were neither ethical nor legal. What Dad hadn't been expecting was that all the addicts getting substances from this guy were very upset. A few things started making sense after that. The time the dogs broke the glass door? Nope, someone had tried to break in and got scared off by the dogs. Dad's sudden interest in guns and teaching us how to shoot? Surely that's because stepmother's family is all ranchers, right? I mean, that's why I learned to throw a lasso when I was like 6 to 7. Nope, it was because Dad was scared for our family's safety, but also wanted to make sure we knew that guns were not toys and that we'd know how to use them if we were ever in a situation where that knowledge could save our lives. Never told him I found out. He tried so hard to shield us from the reality of the situation.
Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed today's video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to see more videos about stories of our lives. Click on one of these videos to watch more and see you soon.